You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Doug Norrie here saying thanks for making us your first listen today and every other day that ends with Y. Not Saturdays and Sundays, so don't worry about that. But every day of the week. No Adam Arbrecht in here today, as you can see. Got another guy on the line, but wanted to catch up with him in terms of just overall Nets knowledge, just sort of basketball expertise. We have Lucas Kaplan from Nets Daily. If you haven't read his stuff on Nets Daily yet, you're missing out. Wanted to talk about a couple pieces he's written recently and just kind of catch up on Nets stuff in general. Lucas, how's it going, brother?
It's going great. Good to be here. Had an entertaining Nets game last night, so there's not a lot to complain about right now.
Yeah, for sure. I was like, because when I reached out to Lucas earlier in the week, I kind of sidestepped the part where Kyrie was coming back because I wanted to specifically talk about Kessler Edwards and Nic Claxton because he had written these just super detailed video breakdowns, which we're going to get to in a little bit. If those people out there haven't heard, give us like they don't have to make an amended version of sort of like where you are, sports journalism, Nets Daily, goals, background, just to give people a little bit of a feel for kind of where you've come into covering the Nets.
Yeah, no, that's good. I'd be happy to. Nets started super young. I actually lived the whole life in Manhattan, right near MSG, like Midtown, Hell's Kitchen. But my dad never pushed any team upon me. And, when I was growing up, the Nets had Carter and Kidd and Jefferson, and I was much more drawn to them on local cable. So I've been loving the Nets ever since then. And then sort of when I got to college a few years ago, I was like, man, I might as well just start sharing my thoughts with the good people on Twitter. I mean, there's really a community out there and people seem to take it as seriously as I do. But that's really my Nets story. Other than that, I'm currently at Northwestern right now, University. I'll be graduating in the summer and hopefully going somewhere in sports journalism. So that about, covers all of that.
One of the cool things I think, we'll talk about Kyrie here in a second, but one of the cool things I think that's sort of happened in Nets world, especially with I would call it like the content ecosystem, is that it's much more suited or I guess I would say populated. I'm not going to include myself in this because you're clearly younger than me, but like with a lot of good up and coming young writers, that is something that's an interesting thing I think that's happened. And I'm not sure if it's because the team is like sort of still up and coming in a weird way, or if it's because, in terms of a national landscape, it's just hasn't had the same sort of cachet in the past. But have you found that? Because I know that like a lot of the Nets Daily guys and this isn't a knock, this is very cool. I think it's like a lot of guys are just younger guys but the voices, like if you didn't know, like if you hadn't said you were in Northwestern, like if you read your stuff, you'd be like, oh, this guy's been covering basketball for a decade. It's not the case, but, do you find that like interesting, or is it like, or the Nets just offer like a good opportunity for if you are an up and coming voice? It just doesn't seem like it's an overpopulated space right now.
I think it's a few things. I think one, it's very interesting that the Nets have taken on such a larger presence in sort of the national mediascape, but they still have retained sort of the core fan base, which I don't think has grown a ton. Mm-hmm. So when I started posting clips, like March of, I think right around the pandemic, like February, January 2020, right before then, it was very easy to break into the space just because there weren't a ton of people doing that. And I think because of sort of that low barrier of entry, that definitely contributes to a lot of, I think, younger, creators in the space. And it is also the Nets still being a relatively new franchise in terms of moving to Brooklyn and sort of finding a new fan base that way and more people interested in the team. I guess that move sort of just re-injected a certain energy and a certain buzz about them, and people maybe looking for new basketball teams to root for have been drawn to them over the last few years.
Yeah, I just have this feeling that we're going to look back at this like timeline of Nets guys covering the Nets and writing about the Nets, and it's going to look pretty interesting. It's like it's Brooks, it's obviously Pooch has made a name for himself. And there's a bunch Chris Mullen over at Nets Daily. The list is gonna, I think I have just this feeling that we're gonna look like 10 years from now and be like, oh, it's interesting. A lot of these guys were writing about the same team early on. All right, let's talk Kyrie. So we covered this last night on the podcast into today. A lot of it was a lot of rah-rah stuff. I think fair. That was just because just the way the game played out and just the way Kyrie sort of put his stamp on it as well. What were your initial thoughts? And you could even go back to before the game about like reinserting Kyrie into this mix, what it was going to look like, and like what you ended up seeing from the first game back, which for him was like the first game in over 200 days on the basketball court.
Well, I had a tweet earlier that morning was like, Kyrie's going to take like 3 shots in the first half. Just sort of.
I saw that.
Yeah, just like knowing him, how the game was going to go. He ended up, I think, taking like 6. So I wasn't too far off. But, yeah, a lot of it was reminiscent of last year's Nets, sort of after they had traded for Harden, especially that first half, just like, what are we doing on defense? Like, what is anybody going to communicate? Sort of where's the effort? I think stuff we're all familiar with that by this point. But there is a lot of good stuff. A lot of the rah-rah is definitely warranted. I mean, for one, you can have Patty Mills off the ball, spacing the floor as a shooter, and have a secondary ball handler. He just kind of slides everyone down a roll, which is very much needed for this team. And then other than that, you can run actions where you have 3 capable shooting threats on the weak side. Like in the fourth quarter, there were a few Harden-Bembry actions with KD, Mills, and Kyrie, all spacing. That is much more reminiscent of sort of the Death Star Nets, like, who pick your poison, who on earth do you help off of?
And I think one of those actions ended up being sort of the nail when Patty Mills hit the corner 3 off, and that ended up becoming, I wouldn't say that was like the stamp on the game, but that felt like it, because it felt like, okay, Patty Mills finally hits a 3, and the game's kind of over. You feel like the game's pretty much over at that point. And I totally agree with you about this cascading effect of their roster, where everyone without him was playing one spot, probably above their pay grade or their skill set. And they can kind of make it work, but it's just not a long-term solution. And, Patty did as much as possible, right? We got as much probably as you could ever hope to imagine out of some of these like no 3 all D wings. And but then when you're not asking them to do that anymore, it just creates this whole other sort of dynamic. Do you see that game? Like, it looks so comfortable right from the start. Do you think this starts a ball rolling downhill, or do you think sort of the rockiness of having him in and out of the lineup, right? Because since he can't play at home, like, do you think it like they're gonna have to re-ramp it up every single time, or do you think you can kind of just like live with the idea that you're going to be shuttling him sort of in and out of the lineup at this point?
That's a good question. Something that's interesting is that after that game, 11 out of their next 17 are on the road.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, beneficial. They get to play with him on the court more often. Another thing that helps is that he can actually practice now. So even though, for us, it's the same, for them, they get to spend a lot more on-court time with him, especially guys a little bit deeper in the rotation or that weren't here last year. But in terms of the game-to-game scenarios, I think we'll see a gradual, improvement of just chemistry and knowing how to play together. And I would also hope sort of the effort and intensity picks up, just because there's a very limited amount of time that they have with him, even though it's only January. I mean, assuming, mandate, vaccine, whatever, this whole playing status doesn't change, they only have about, 20 games with him before the playoffs, 25. Yeah. It's not as much time right now as it feels like. So I would hope that we get, every game a little bit more of a noticeable bump, just in terms of their sort of comfort level with Kyrie.
Yeah, because I'm totally with you on the effort. It was super disappointing. Just the second chance points continue to be a massive problem. Like the opposing offensive rebounding becomes a massive problem. I'm like not so. I kind of don't care as much about the offensive rebounding piece because I think at sometimes, and maybe you can disagree with this, I think there are times where teams make that sort of a marching order because it allows for better transition opportunities. So you sort of sell out on the transition and just give up a little bit on the offensive glass. And I think with this team, that's a calculation I think that I'd be okay with, just because transitionally you'll never be able to stop them. But do you see like am I crazy for thinking that? Because I know it's super easy to look at the offensive rebound numbers, especially what happened against Memphis, and just like want to blow your brains out. But it does feel like there is a part of this where it's like, yes, we understand that we're super bad at this, but it's to accomplish another goal.
Right. The Memphis game was just brutal because not only did they not grab any boards, they were also getting killed in transition. So
Right.
it's just the worst of both worlds. That can't happen. In terms of the offensive rebounding, I do agree with you just because if, everything the Nets say, we're trying to get better each day, we're reaching our ultimate goal, it's in the distance to be the team we want to be. That team, you would imagine, looks like last year's team, where it's a pace and space team. They're smaller on average, and they kill you from three and even the mid range, in the fourth quarter with KD, and they don't grab a ton of boards. I
Mhm.
think the offensive rebounding pivot, in the last month or so without Kyrie, without Joe, was a nice band aid for things. Bembry grabbed a ton, David Duke Jr., Claxton. But in the long run, I would say I'm okay with them less, prioritizing less of the offensive glass just to get back in transition because you hope, adding Kyrie, adding Joe back, the shooting percentages go upwards, and that means that you don't need to attack the offensive glass as much. So yeah, ultimately, I don't think their destiny as a team is one that really prioritizes the offensive glass, and
I don't
I'm
think they
okay.
prioritize on the defensive glass either. Like that's kind of what I was saying. It's like I think there's times where they don't. Maybe we conflated our offensive rebounding thing, but I think that I think in general, I agree with everything you're saying. I think it's in general that's just not where they've wanted to live because I think that they're probably just not all that good at it on either end, especially on the defensive when they're on the defensive boards when you kind of want Harden being maybe one of your primary rebounders because he can start transition stuff. Like you just are going to
Yeah,
give stuff up. All right, I want to get to some more of this stuff. I want to get into what Lucas wrote here about Kessler Edwards, what he wrote about Nic Claxton, because it's really some interesting stuff, especially as we get into late season and how some of these guys might begin to slot into, championship sort of caliber teams and the skill sets they bring. Got to talk to you first about our friends over at Prize Picks, the very best DFS prop game on the market. Point stop. You don't want to go to these big operators. You're dealing with folks that are putting in thousands of lineups. You're trying to deal with massive bankrolls. Like maybe they have algorithms that are kind of pumping stuff out that you'll never be able to deal with. Prize Picks has solved that for you. They just put the props up. It's you versus the numbers. You take your knowledge of the game, really any sport you can imagine too, and you put it up there on Prize Picks. The best DFS prop game on the market, really in terms of operators, is basically second to none. If you go over there now, you make a deposit. They're going to match you 100% up to $100. You have to use the promo code NBA. It's easy to remember. Your favorite sport. You pick 2 to 5 players, pick the over under on their projections, help you win up to 10x. That's 10 times, folks. Go to over there just for the upside alone. You can make picks in under 60 seconds. Super easy. Go to prizepicks.com. Use the promo code NBA. Go to your app store, download the app. Prize Picks is daily fantasy made easy. If you're not playing Prize Picks, you honestly don't know what you're missing. And when you're done with Prize Picks, you're going to hear a little sound. And that sound is that sound. Cha-ching. That's the sound of another sale being made for your company over on Shopify. Look, if you're a company that's in growth mode, or maybe you're already at scale, or you're somewhere in between, Shopify has you covered for really anywhere your business is along the life cycle of a business. It gives entrepreneurs the resources that at one point it was just the big businesses that had access to this stuff. Not anymore. Upstarts, startups, established businesses, all can use Shopify. They make it really easy to integrate across social networks. So you've already have a big following. You can integrate what you have over there, put it in the Shopify, see the sales grow. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Pinterest. You heard of these guys. You gain insights as you grow with detailed reporting, conversion rates, profit margins. Those are the things you like to hear about when you got your business going. You go to shopify.com/lockedonnba. Make sure it's all lowercase. You're going to get a free 14-day trial, get full access to Shopify's entire suite of features. Grow your business with Shopify today. Go to shopify.com/lockedonnba right now. Shopify.com/lockedonnba. spoti.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, I'm going to frame this first part about Nic Claxton, and it's going to have to do a little bit with the game yesterday, and I want your opinion. So you've watched a ton of Nic Claxton tape, probably as much as most other people, I would suspect, around the thing, just based on some of the stuff you've written. Last night against, and I think this is a good starting point for what happened last night. Last night he's playing well, has an amazing closeout, sort of up and down the court, amazing closeout on Holiday, and then kind of transitioned that back into a great offensive rebound on the other end that he turns into an and one. But then he picks up his fifth foul and doesn't play the rest of the game because they effectively close with KD at the 5. I'll just say KD was playing 5 at that point. I know they were doing different stuff with Sabonis. Where do you stand with Claxton right now after having watched him, knowing he didn't close last night in a game you probably would have thought he would have, especially against a team that's big? And where does he slot for you in terms of sort of optimal Nets rotations? Because I think there's a world where it might be at something like an inflection point around Nic Claxton about whether what he is right now. But let me give you your thoughts on Nic Claxton. Didn't close last night, but clearly has the ability to. Where do you see him sort of slotting into this rotation now?
That's an interesting way to frame that question, because I've been thinking recently, and last night I think is ample evidence for it. Is he in the Bruce Brown sort of DeAndre Bembry rotation, kind of grouping of players, more so than the Griffin, Aldridge, big men who don't really space the floor sort of mush that I think a lot of us on Nets Twitter have come to, separate those two groups. Like, we have our smaller non-shooters that sort of guard wings and guards, and then we have our bigger non-shooters that, are mostly stationed in the paint. And I think just because Claxton is 6'11", even though he can switch and all that, and gets a lot of offensive rebounds, we tend to group him with the latter. Whereas really watching him guard, I think I'm getting more and more of the sense this guy's a wing. He just can't really shoot.
Right.
Because you see him on Sabonis, that is the one part of his game that I think, is we're going to need an offseason, something like that, just the strength. A lot of the reason he was in foul trouble, I think, is because, Sabonis hits him in the chest and then he sort of folds down. His arms come down. That's a foul every time. Going to KD at the 5 was a really nice decision, I think, by Nash, because he was like, yes, Claxton may be a nominal big man or whatever, but he's not that much better on the defensive glass than KD, plus Harden, plus Bembry. And the floor spacing, the offensive capability is just sort of too much to pass up. We can get away with it. It felt like a big sort of step forward in just thinking about Claxton as a different sort of position.
So when you see him, though, because I know that there's plenty of tape that suggests, especially if you go back to college, that his offensive game, I don't want to say has regressed, because I think he's just probably asked to do something different. But is there a world? Let me think of how I want to frame this. So is there a world where, one, the Nets can't and will never be able to fully unlock sort of his potential on the offensive end, just because there's simply no need to when you have these other guys? And at that point, is he an expendable piece that you might want to try to bring something else back for? Or is he a guy that can effectively play meaningful rotation minutes in high leverage playoff series? Because I think that's really probably all we're thinking about now. Is we know he can play in the regular season, but high leverage, crunch time, dynamic opposing wings or ball handlers, is he a rotational piece? Because I think the Nets have to frame all their decisions now based on that sort of framework. So sort of in that hierarchy, where do you see him? Because I think that's or is there just more that we need to get out of him on the offensive end too? Where do you stand with that? Because I think you've watched a ton of tape on him.
No, I agree with that framework. You have to start thinking about the roster in terms of what's this guy doing when it's game 7 of the finals and there's 5 minutes left and it's a tie game, things like that. Right now, I think the offensive potential, or at least the skill set that he displays, if it was ever going to be fully realized, it's not going to be with the Nets. And I think that's okay, based on the personnel they have. But you see the glimpses, him handling the ball in tight corners, just the fluidity at that size. if you watch like some G League games when he has 30 points, he's not just dunking off the roll. He's like attacking guys straight up. So there's interesting flashes for sure. But I think offensively right now on this team, you need him to master his craft. Guys around stars are much more valuable when they're, not a jack of all trades, but sort of a master of one.
Sure.
And they clearly believe in him, Harden especially, as the prototypical rim diver, offensive board, put back, dunk, sprint the floor, which I think is a positive sign. I do believe that this is a guy that, you can trust out there, high leverage situations. To be fair, though, the Nets are going to need to help him out when he's guarding, the bruisers of the world, the Sabonises, the Embiids. There aren't a lot of those guys really.
Giannis too, like guys like
Yeah.
Giannis as well, like because I know people don't think of Giannis that way, but he is
true.
like among the very strongest guys out there too, and athletic. So like, and
That's a
I'm
great
not sure.
point.
I think people think that Nic Claxton can like sort of hold up with guys like that because he's also tall and skinny, but I don't think that's really been proven. So
I don't really think so either. That's a good point about Giannis. The other thing, though, is I think he fits into the idealized version of the Nets, smaller but long and athletic rather than just big. So that gives me hope about him too.
And his ability to switch too feels like it's if they're want to run like high leverage switching schemes, then he probably has shown enough to be able to hold up. And also too, like I know that they didn't bring him back into the game yesterday, and that felt a little bit more probably like, hey, we're just gonna go all offense here because we're still in comeback mode, and he probably just fell victim. I wonder if he just fell victim to that circumstance more than it just wasn't going to happen. I don't think like the game really would have turned out too differently had he stayed on the court. I think they still would have won. So I don't think it's an indictment on him that he didn't close. But it is an interesting thing to see, like, if you're going to play KD at the 5, then maybe no one will be able to stop them on offense at all. All right, I want to get into Kessler Edwards here because you have some stuff. I know, Adam's not here today, but Adam has been on Kessler Edwards. What do you call it? Like, what's the thing when you're like the island? There's not really an island.
He's been on the Cass Express.
But yeah, the Kess Express. That's right. Adam wanted him like starting like 4 weeks ago or something like that. So he was disappointed to hear we were going to talk about that, and he wasn't going to be here. Going to get to that in a second. First, got to jump into Built Bar. These guys, we've been talking about them forever. It's a new year. You're trying to get healthy. I know I am. Sometimes snacking can get in the way of that. It's okay. It doesn't have to happen anymore. You jump over and grab a Built Bar. No, they started with the flavors. Just to make it so it'd be an easy transition: peanut butter brownie, raspberry, cookies and cream, salted caramel. Just some of what you're going to get from Built Bar, 100% covered in chocolate. So you're starting to think, how could this be healthy for you? Don't worry, folks. The analytics back these bad boys up. 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein. That is what you want to hear. Compare that to a candy bar. I'm not even going to read it to you because they absolutely dust the stats on a candy bar. Tastes just as good. And like I said, all the flavors to back it up. If you go to built.com right now, use the promo code 15%. Oh, excuse me. That's not, you don't want to use the promo code 15%. You want to use the promo code LOCKED15 and you're going to get 15% off at built.com. They taste great. The Locked On Network's huge fans of these. They fight in the group chat about what the best flavors are. Can't really get a better testimonial than that. Go to built.com, grab the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off. Built.com. All right, Kessler Edwards. So sort of a deeper cut, I think, based on haven't seen him since the COVID protocols, and they're just coming off a win over a game in a game where he did not appear. So it can seem a little bit like, okay, where did Kessler Edwards come from? But I do. Okay, well, first of all, just to start, you wrote a piece about Kessler Edwards. He has not played in the last couple of days. Do you think that's a Nash thing, a conditioning thing, a end the bench thing? Like, where would you slot? I'm not sure they specifically talked about it, probably because no one's needed to ask. But where do you think it's like some combination of the three of them, or you think it's just conditioning? Because it feels weird to have not seen him based on how well he's played.
It's funny. I think it's everything. I think it's the conditioning comes into it in that I don't think they would play him, especially if they weren't 100% certain he was in tip-top shape and he just he might not be there yet. But we haven't seen Cam really since the COVID protocols either. It just feels like maybe Nash and the Nets as a whole are getting into this part of the season. Kyrie's coming back where it's like no more screwing around. We're keeping things to an 8, maybe 9-man rotation. We're really starting to find what's working for the playoffs. And, I would not be surprised at all if they don't really envision him as part of the playoff rotation and therefore are cutting his minutes.
It's so funny because I would agree with you right up until the part where David Duke Jr. started and then stopped playing. Because they start David Duke Jr. and that's sort of it's like, oh, okay, I'm all for trying new things and all good. And Nash is, I think, taking some lumps around some of these rotational things. Some of it I don't think it's his fault. Some maybe is, but I'm with you on that part. And make the case or not, but I think you probably can, based on some of the stuff you've written, make the case for Kessler Edwards maybe deserving more of a look here in this current iteration of the Nets. And I'm going to include the iteration that includes Kyrie, because I think that that's probably most fundamental to like where we are here. But is there a case for him in what you've seen on tape so far that would make it so that I'm not comparing him to Claxton, but like, is there a world that you can see his skill set meshing with what else is happening on a, I'll stop short of championship level, but like on a playoff ready sort of like good team, can Kessler Edwards fit into that mix?
Yeah, well, it's good you brought up David Duke Jr. Starting last night, because that, we have to bring that up in terms of if we're talking about Nash and the rotation. But it feels like they did that as sort of a reward for David Duke Jr. He's done nothing but impressed them. Everyone's raved about it. And part of that is just on a team whose effort level everybody can see has gone up and down at times. Duke has clearly injected some hustle, grit, that energy, whatever you want to call it. When you turn on the Kess tape, it's a lot of the same in a very different skill set. The crux of my article is that, yes, this is in a lot of ways your prototypical huge umbrella term 3-and-D guy. But he's a really live body. He's ripped. I mean, we can all see that. He fights, he's strong, and he brings that sort of athleticism and, classic youthful energy to a team that doesn't have a lot of it. So that, I think, if you're making the case for him to start or at least be a piece on a playoff team, that plays into it, as well as just this guy has a track record as a good to great shooter. I mean, if we take all of his attempts from college to the pros, it's like 500, and he's right around the 40% mark. There's nothing really in there to suggest that he won't keep knocking down threes, which is, listicle number A or letter A.
Right.
We got to get that. I mean, if we're going to play another wing, another non-ball dominant guy, he's going to have to shoot because we already have Bembry, Brown, so on. And then other than that, the defensive instincts are really what jump out. And he's a communicator, and he's just hustling all over the court. It just feels in a lot of ways like a guy you would want to have around your ball-dominant superstars, spacing the floor, hustling, creating events out there. And I think the case for him to play, in a playoff setting is really that simple. He's a low-usage guy that you really want around your stars.
Yeah, and that's something that I think that the team is missing in terms of all the guys they brought in. I'm not going to compare him to Jeff Green, but I think for the purposes of this thought process, like he's probably the closest in terms of doesn't need the ball, can do a little bit off the bounce if you probably need him to. Good instincts, like not the biggest, like Green's pretty big. Like he's not as big as Green, so I don't think it's like that's necessarily the thing, but they just don't have this other guy because it's clearly not Joe Harris. And all the guys you mentioned have some other glaring hole in their game. Like they can't shoot the three at all. They're just a little too small. Paul Millsap looks like he's like 1 foot in the grave. Like there's just James Johnson has like all the confidence in the world and is really good on defense, but you kind of like don't want him doing a ton of stuff on offense. Like there's all these guys that like are really good. And most of that's hidden by the fact that the superstars are going to be the superstars and you can just kind of stay in your lane.
Right.
Like a guy like Jeff Green was so important to what they did last season. And I do think they've sort of missed that one piece of that. Like, do you see that as a comp or like, do you see, or, I mean, it's not perfect, but it's like, I wonder, but I just can't think of anyone close to Green's skill set on the team now.
Well, it's just interesting how many guys that are taller than 6'2" on the Nets can both shoot the three and will force defenders to respect the three and also play valuable defense, play legitimate above average defense.
Who's the list? Is there a
Is
list?
it just KD? Is it just KD?
And you can't even use him because like you can't put him on any like he'd be on every list you'd ever make. So like
Right, of
so you
course.
take him off, and then so who else is it after that?
I mean, yeah, I think Joe Harris is an average, passable defender. I don't have huge qualms with him on that end. But, the point, you can see the list gets very short. And even looking around the league, like a team like Milwaukee didn't revamp their roster, but, man, they look younger this year with Allen and Connaughton getting more minutes sort of than PJ Tucker and Lopez with the injury. They
Yep.
look more athletic. They look sleeker. They're flying around the perimeter. And I wouldn't really be too happy with the Nets walking into that matchup with the sort of, ancillary guys being old, creaky, slow to get back on defense. I would just, from a purely visual athletic standpoint, the first thing that jumps off your screen, I would want it to be guys like Kessler Edwards. And then the shooting is a bonus, to put it lightly.
And you can live with mistakes. And like, that's what I mean about the superstars being able to mask so much of what you do, because you can live with sort of mistakes on that end. And we started to see that where it finally was hitting ahead recently, where it's pre-Kyrie, it's like kind of Harden and KD's there. It's these three non-shooters. There's nowhere to operate.
No.
Like even guys that are among and it's only because they're so good that they didn't look so terrible. And believe me, like almost anybody else in that KD and Harden spot, it would have just been an absolute bloodbath. And only because they're so transcendent that it didn't. But like, there's only so many minutes you can get away from them. Kyrie solves so much of it, so like whatever. And Joe Harris solves a certain portion of it as well when he comes back. But you almost can never have too many guys like Edwards, it feels like. And then if they're a little bit bigger and shoot a little bit worse, or they're a little bit more athletic and they shoot a little, or whatever it is, like you can kind of toggle the dials just a little bit.
Yeah.
But so let me finish off with this. I know you kind of have a heart out here. My final question, and this is more about the team. It feels like we're in a weird place with where Nash is right now in terms of Nets. I don't want to call it fandom because I usually don't love using that as a barometer, but I'll just say, I've defended Nash a decent amount, mostly for reasons that are not X's and O related, because I think that sometimes fans miss the point where like it kind of only matters what KD and Harden and these guys want. And so like they like you can just do like have the board be blank and just go out there. And I think like it kind of doesn't matter, but at some point it does, like because the rotations and these things will matter along the margins. Where do you stand with sort of the job that Nash has done this season in terms of combinations, in terms of like moments? Well, I'm just not going to couch it. Where do you stand with where Nash has done as a coach this year?
It's hard to evaluate. Losing D'Antoni was big for a rookie coach that definitely, had his hand held. Not to infantilize Nash too much, but D'Antoni was there to guide him through in the offense. All of a sudden, you lose D'Antoni, you lose Kyrie, you lose Joe Harris for big portions of the season. You lose really your only big man that can shoot in Jeff Green. Blake's not hitting any threes. He had to deal with a lot offensively, X's and O's, and a lot of new rotation pieces. Some of the rotation, decisions are very warranted because on one hand, you have the Nets with a clear shift in focus this year, I think. Like, we're getting the 1 seed. We're getting home court. Whereas last year, it was more, let's just keep everybody healthy. Didn't work out, obviously. But if you're keeping those rotation, if you're keeping that goal in mind, the rotation decisions have to match it. And it's felt like at some points it hasn't matched it. Like, okay, these guys have no energy. They're getting blown out on the glass. Why aren't we pivoting to the young guys? Why are we going 8 deep when a lot of these guys clearly have dead legs? And if that 1 seed, if that's your goal, as it's clearly been more so this year, I think that is the basis to question some of his decisions. Like, pick a lane, Are we developing? Are we just trying things out? Or are we trying to win these games? A guy like Kessler Edwards, we're going to have to see him now if that's going to be a playoff guy. We can't wait to throw him in the rotation in March and expect him to contribute in May. But other than that, I can't give a grade on him until the playoffs. As with most things Nets related, it all comes down to that. But so far, I think it's been an incomplete. I'm not really too down on him just because he's had to navigate a lot this year. And it's, I know when you're winning, these things don't matter, but it is just his second year as a coach. So maybe the rate of improvement is greater than we're expecting from maybe a veteran coach. I think he's done okay. I'm satisfied, honestly. But there are things I'm definitely monitoring, and I want to revisit it at the end of the year.
Yeah, that's a good point about the incomplete. I think I'm with you. I think that was actually highlighted. We'll get out here in a second, but I think that was highlighted last night where I thought about this when Kyrie came in. I was like, oh yeah, he's like never played with any of these guys. And I
Yeah.
think we think of the Nets. I think we think of the Nets as this sort of like we've been watching them the whole time this season, and it feels like something, feels like DeAndre Bembry's been on the team forever, right? Okay, whatever.
Yeah.
It's like seasons are long. But I was like, oh yeah, Kyrie's never played. He's played with KD some, Harden some. None of the other, like Mills never, Aldridge never, like James Johnson never, Bembry never. Like all the list was so long on guys he'd never stepped on the court with that it does kind of highlight your point of when you think about it that way, you do think, okay, yeah, there's been massive turnover here. I know that we don't look at it that way because like the stars are still the same,
Right.
but I think is that like a fair way to put it where it's like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, but if you frame it that way, then there's this team's almost completely different.
Yeah, this team has had, and even the Stars, they've had 14 games together. And I think
Right.
I saw they've had 15, and they're including Harden hurting his hamstring 4 seconds into the Milwaukee game and that Toronto game where KD was in and out and in and out. So if it's 13 real games, that's nothing. I mean, there has been such a lack of continuity with this team. And for the Nets just to continually win games, we see Steve Nash has like the 5th winningest record of all time as a coach, this and that. And it's like, yeah, he has Kyrie and Harden and KD,
Right.
but that's hard, man. That's hard when everything is shuffling around.
And I think it's important for just folks to just kind of remember that like when there's inconsistency or there's just a lot of fluctuations and stuff, like it's just not going to look complete. Or I don't know, I'm not giving him a pass, but like you just at least need to factor it into it. Okay.
Yeah.
That is Lucas Kaplan. He is from Nets Daily. You have to read his stuff. I'll put the link to the Claxton piece and the Kessler Edwards piece in the show notes. Go check those out. It makes really good cases for sort of like their growth and what they bring to the court. Lucas, thank you so much for coming on. I hope to have you back on in sometime in the future.
Of course. My pleasure.